This goes without saying, but cheating in any sport is a bad thing to do. It's unsportsmanlike, it can turn the fans against you, and it can get you penalized. And in combat sports, cheating can lead to the victim of cheating taking irreversible, life-altering damage. However, in MMA, fighters cheat and get away with it all the time. From shorts grabbing, to scoring TKOs with eye rakes, to getting marketed as the GOAT of the sport by the UFC despite testing positive for PEDs numerous times, fighters cheat to win at an astonishing frequency. However, what people haven't asked is, what are the best ways to cheat in the UFC? What methods of cheating are the easiest to get away with while giving a fighter the greatest advantages? Well, we will be going over those today by ranking the ways to cheat in the UFC from the worst to the best, with the worst being cheating that is high risk and low return, and the best being cheating that every fighter who wants to become the greatest of all time should be doing. Because, as the age-old saying goes, if you ain't cheating, you ain't trying. So without further ado, let's get started. Without a doubt, the worst way to cheat in the UFC is to soccer kick, stomp, or knee the head of a grounded opponent. And that's because you are almost guaranteed to get penalized for these strikes. Famously, Petr Yan got DQ'd and lost his belt to Aljamain Sterling because he threw a knee to the dome after Aljo failed a takedown. And when you consider what Petr Yan did to Merab Dvalishvili in their rematch, we could be calling Petr Yan the GOAT of bantamweight right now if this didn't happen. Similarly, John Jones nearly lost his belt to Anthony Smith after throwing a knee while Mr. On Paper was curled up along the fence, and ended up getting 2 points deducted by Herb Dean due to the infraction. And Anthony Smith not taking the DQ victory here is also what led to him getting that retirement package with Jelly Bean and his desk job at the UFC. A couple other lesser known examples include Louis Saldana fumbling a win over Sean Woodson due to an illegal knee, and Seth Basinski getting disqualified for flatlining Brad Tavares with a soccer kick to the chin at the buzzer on Season 11 of The Ultimate Fighter. There is no point in cheating using these strikes because if they so much as graze your opponent, that gives them an opportunity to take a breather and recover, or even take a DQ win. These banned strikes are easy for referees to spot, making it virtually impossible to cheat discreetly with them, and refs are also very quick to take points for these strikes, so there's absolutely no upside. And I mean, it's kind of ridiculous because these strikes do basically the same amount of damage as regular knees or head kicks, but hey, the athletic commissions in the US are populated with idiots, so there's not much that can be done to fix this. And yes, as you can see here from this photo of former Bellator fighter Danny Sabatello throwing soccer kicks to the face, there is a certain MMA organization that actually allows these attacks, which leads to more exciting fights. I mean, it's crazy how a change in the rules there leads to a guy who was deemed too boring to be in the UFC after winning on Contender Series end up throwing soccer kicks and stomps the guy's face. But that's just something I wanted to bring to your attention. Because personally, I think this form of cheating should be legal. However, in the UFC as it is today, it is the most illegal and least useful way to cheat. Because, frankly, there is no upside to doing it. You can get DQ'd, you can lose points, it's easy for refs to spot, and when they spot it, they're most likely going to penalize you. Because it is very difficult to argue that a strike to a grounded opponent wasn't intentional. So, this is at the bottom of the list. So biting your opponent in MMA may sound crazy, and well, it sounds crazy because it is crazy and it is a pretty dumb way to cheat. If you get caught doing it, biting your opponent is a straight path to getting disqualified and instantly released from the UFC, as happened to Igor Severino after he bit his opponent Andre Lima. Now, Igor's biting was very severe, leading to Lima having a very deep bite mark on his bicep and getting a Bite of the Night bonus from Dana White. And ever since Igor got cut from the UFC, he's been kinda cursed because although he's signed with Octagon and has fought for them once, he's had 5 canceled fights in a row and has lost a literal year off his career due to the cancellations. Yeah, so biting your opponent is a very high-risk move, as it can literally ruin your career. And frankly, if you do go so low as to bite your opponent, you probably do deserve to have that happen to you. However, I'm placing biting as more effective than illegal strikes because, while the risk is very high, you can get away with the foul if you're discreet about it. An example of this is Wes Sims versus Mike Kyle, which is a bout that took place all the way back in 2004 on UFC 47. In this fight, Mike Kyle bit Wes Sims on the chest before knocking him out in the first round, with the bite marks being very clear on the pec. However, the fight hasn't been overturned to a no contest and remains a TKO victory for Kyle. Another instance of alleged biting not leading to an instant DQ was Nurullo Aliev versus Rafael Alves, where Nurullo Aliev was penalized 1 point by referee Mark Smith for allegedly biting Rafael Alves during a grappling exchange. However, in this case, even though Mark Smith said that he had very clearly seen a bite mark on Alves, there was no clear video evidence that the biting had taken place. Biting, as long as you don't do it too hard to the point where there are visible marks on your opponent, can be an effective way to force your way through grappling exchanges. Still, due to the sheer number of camera angles that the UFC has for their fights, you are more than likely going to get caught if you chomp down on your fellow fighter. But maybe at the regional level of MMA, where there are fewer cameras to capture footage of the bout, it can definitely be something to consider doing if you're caught in a tight submission or trying to control your opponent. So yes, a very high risk foul with low to moderate returns. Fish hooking and oil checks are very niche, very gross, and very underutilized ways of cheating in MMA. Fish hooking involves inserting one's fingers into the nostrils or mouth of an opponent, and an oil check is where one takes a finger or two and sticks it right into their opponent's, rear end. Sticking your fingers into your opponent's orifices is disgusting, but because the foul is so uncommon, referees often don't penalize the act even though it is very easy to spot. Fish hooking can be a useful way to manipulate your opponent's head to set up a choke or defend a takedown by manipulating their head position. On the other hand, oil checks are of very little use in grappling exchanges, but they are a great way to psychologically damage your opponent. Although you shouldn't do it against Peyton Talbot, Michael Morales, Jeff Molina, or John Jones since you're just going to turn them on. A prime example of fish hooking in the UFC is the fight between Dustin Poirier and Michael Chandler, where Chandler fish hooked Dustin by sticking his fingers into Dustin's mouth. However, fish hooking your opponent's mouth carries the significant downside of being a way of cheating that can be countered by further cheating, as Dustin Poirier bit down on Chandler's fingers. Therefore, while fish hooking is not penalized often, and can be very effective for forcing opponents into tough grappling positions, the fact that it is very easy to spot and can be countered by your opponent's own cheating leaves it pretty low on the list. Hitting your opponent after the buzzer is a moderately risky, but also moderately high reward way of cheating. It all comes down to how badly you're able to hurt your opponent and whether or not the referee decides to take a point for the strikes. One of the worst, or depending upon how you look at it, best examples of strikes after the buzzer being utilized in a fight was Holly Holm versus Germaine de Randamie for the vacant women's featherweight title back when that division was still a thing. In this fight, de Randamie struck Holly Holm after the buzzer of the second and third round, with Holm getting visibly concussed by the strikes thrown. However, despite there being obvious damage, the referee only issued a warning to de Randamie after the second time that de Randamie threw strikes after the buzzer. And in the end, de Randamie won the fight by unanimous decision. Another instance where this happened was the rematch between Jose Aldo and Chad Mendes at UFC 179, where Jose Aldo dropped Chad Mendes with strikes after the bell at the end of round 1. However, in this case, Mark Goddard, Jose Aldo, and Chad Mendes have all said that they couldn't hear the buzzer due to how loud the Brazilian crowd was. But, nevertheless, Jose Aldo technically committed a foul and wasn't penalized for it. Attacking your opponent after the buzzer can result in a point deduction, although it's actually surprisingly rare. And if you are able to concuss your opponent with strikes, that can lead to a significant advantage. But if you aren't able to hurt your opponent and unluckily end up getting a point deduction, well, then you're just, out of luck, right? Furthermore, the referee might call a timeout to let your opponent recover even if they aren't significantly hurt, in turn giving them an opportunity to rest and recover. And then there's also the risk that you just KO your opponent out cold, and then you're just going to get a DQ or a no contest. So you have to get it just right, like how Jermaine Durandamy did. You need to hurt your opponent badly enough to wobble them and give them brain fog without knocking them out. The double risk of doing too little damage or doing too much damage is why this method of cheating is pretty far down on this list. So just to explain what this method of cheating is, the Brazilian tap is where, when you're caught in a submission, you fake a light tap to get your opponent to release the submission and then just continue to fight regardless. Now, I don't know why this is called a Brazilian tap, besides the stereotype that Brazilians are more likely to do it than, anybody else, but the name has just stuck. Brazilian taps are a very risky form of cheating, as if the referee sees you tapping to submission and steps in to stop the fight, well, you've just lost the bout. They are also very limited in their scope of use, as the only time you're going to be able to use a Brazilian tap is when you are caught in a submission. The most notable example of a Brazilian tap in modern MMA comes from Renan Ferreira's bout against Fabricio Verdum at PFL 3, where Renan Ferreira tapped out the Verdum's triangle choke and then proceeded to beat up Verdum on the ground. This led to Renan getting a round 2 TKO, but the fight was overturned to a no contest when the New Jersey State Athletic Commission found footage that showed that Renan had clearly tapped to the choke. Now, this might make it seem like the Brazilian tap wasn't effective, but in Renan's case, it led to him having a no contest instead of a loss on his record, which is pretty positive if you ask me. And back in the day, Matt Lindland literally got submitted twice in the same fight by Murilo Bustamante because he faked a tap and protested the stoppage to referee John McCarthy, who then restarted the fight despite the stoppage. However, since that happened all the way back in 2002, and MMA officiating has come a long way since then, you can't expect things to go like that any longer. Nevertheless, it can get you a second chance if you're able to hide the tap well enough, so the Brazilian tap does serve its purpose as a high risk, high reward, and rather niche way of cheating. Intentionally spitting out your mouthguard is a stalling tactic that can be employed to get the referee to call a timeout, giving you the chance to catch a breather while putting your mouthguard back in. This method of cheating often goes unnoticed, as it is almost impossible to tell whether losing your mouthguard is intentional or not. As far as I'm aware, the last time a fighter was penalized for this happening was Aaron Rosa versus Matt Lucas all the way back in 2011, where Matt Lucas had a point deducted for spitting out his mouthguard too many times. Besides that, while there are many instances of fighters being given warnings for spitting out their mouthpiece, they all have plausible deniability, making it difficult for the referee to justify a point deduction. However, the upside of this cheating method is relatively small, since the most you're going to get is around 10 to 20 seconds to stick your mouthpiece back in. Furthermore, there is a chance that the referee doesn't call a timeout to put the mouthpiece back in, creating an opening where you're vulnerable to not just being knocked out, but losing a bunch of your teeth because you don't have your mouthpiece. An example of this happening is Silva versus Bisping, where Bisping dropped his mouthpiece, unintentionally or intentionally, I don't know. But before the referee could call a timeout, Silva kneed Bisping brutally and dropped him badly. Now, Bisping went on to win this fight by decision because the stoppage wasn't called, but it still highlights the major risk of intentionally spitting your mouthpiece out as a way of stalling. And to be frank, spitting out your mouthpiece to buy time is inferior in almost every way to striking your opponent in the groin or poking your opponent in the eye to buy time, which are fouls that are going to be far higher up on this list, as spitting out your mouthpiece leaves you vulnerable and buys you much less time. However, because it is almost impossible to notice, and the fact that you don't have to actually hit your opponent to do it, I'd say it is a decently effective way to cheat. From this point on, I'd say that we've gotten into the middle tiers for cheating, and I would say that grabbing your opponent's shorts is definitely around here. It's not the most common way to cheat, but it is also very rarely penalized and can be useful in a variety of grappling situations. The most prominent example of effective shorts grabbing in MMA was Muhammad Mokaev versus Manel Kape, where Mokaev was basically stripping Kape naked with how tightly he was tugging on those trousers. Grabbing the shorts gave Mokaev much more control than if he were to get a clutch around Kape's waist, or if he were to grab Kape's ankles, letting him rack up control time. Although the referee stepped in to stop the action, Mokaev didn't lose a point, and this grappling exchange contributed to Mokaev winning the fight by unanimous decision. Also, while I can't think of any actual examples off the top of my head, grabbing the shorts of an opponent could serve as an alternative to getting a body lock on them, and theoretically speaking, you could grab the shorts to help manipulate the legs in any way you want to in a grappling exchange, be it helping to secure a single leg takedown or helping to pass their guard. However, I can't place grabbing the shorts any higher than this because they don't do direct damage to your opponent like other fouls, and well, they're much more limited in use than other illegal grabs that you'll be seeing further up on this list. Headbutting your opponent is tricky to pull off, but potentially one of the most devastating ways to cheat, and here's why. Smashing the thick part of your skull against your opponent's chin is going to hurt them as much as any punch, if not more, since your head is much bigger than your fist. Even fighters with really good chins, like Kevin Holland and Yair Rodriguez, have been hurt by clashes of heads in their fights with Kyle Dawkins and Alexander Volkanovski respectively, with Kevin getting so concussed that he was unable to continue, leading to the fight becoming a no contest. However, in Yair's case, while he did get time to recover after Volk's headbutt, he was likely still hurt when they resumed the fight, and ended up getting caught and TKO'd shortly after. Now, I'm not saying Volkanovski did this intentionally. However, it still did damage to Yair, and there was no point deduction for the foul. However, the ideal result from a headbutt would be to cause facial damage on your opponent without having the fight end in a no contest. Something like a cut or facial inflammation or a busted nose that doesn't get the fight stopped, but can be exploited to cause further damage. If you headbutt your opponent and open up a cut or cause some swelling, all you need to do are throw a few more punches to really make the blood start flowing. Also, another important point to consider are the judges. Due to the chaotic nature of a fight, it is often difficult to tell what strikes caused what damage. So even if you land a headbutt that causes visible facial damage, who's to say that it wasn't caused by a legal strike? And we all know how incompetent the MMA judges are. They probably see it all the same. However, there's still that ever-present risk that the fight ends in a no contest. And you also have to make sure that the foul looks unintentional, because if you're craning your neck back to headbutt your opponent Lethway style, even Mario Yamasaki will take a point for that. Now, you might be surprised at the placement of PEDs and steroids here on this list, since many of you would have probably put it further up on the list. But there's a reason why they're around the middle of the pack. Unlike cheating in the cage, where the very most you're going to get is a DQ loss, being caught using PEDs can lead to severe consequences. You can have wins overturned to no contests, as happened to the PFL lightweight champion Usman Nurmagomedov, who is also Khabib's cousin. Another possible consequence is getting a championship stripped, which is what happened to Movlid Khabibuliev, the PFL featherweight tournament winner and a teammate of Khabib's, who tested positive for EPO, or even being permanently banned from the UFC after testing positive too many times, which is what happened to Ruslan Magomedov, a former training partner of Khabib's who tested positive 3 times. However, if you do manage to avoid testing positive for steroids, well, that is a huge advantage, like a huge one. One that might even lead to you and your teammates being considered goats of the sport. Who knows? I'm not necessarily accusing anybody of anything, but, where there's smoke, there's fire. But what I'm getting at is that taking PEDs is a high risk, but also a very, very high reward way of cheating. If you get caught, you can lose years off your career, which is what just happened to Kamaru Usman's brother, Muhammad Usman, who received a 2.5-year suspension for testing positive for elevated testosterone levels. But if you don't test positive, you might just work your way up to the point where you're considered, I don't know, maybe one of the greatest welterweight champions of all time. And taking PEDs can improve almost everything in MMA. They can boost recovery from hard training, increase muscle mass, increase red blood cell count for better cardio, boost your punching power, everything. You name it, PEDs can probably do it. They're diuretics to help with weight cuts, EPO and meldonium to boost your cardio, and stimulants to help with reaction time. And if you end up becoming a major star for the promotion, who is pushed as the greatest fighter of all time, the UFC will conveniently ignore any positive tests because it doesn't align with their marketing strategy. So yeah, take PEDs if you can get away with it. But just know that if you can't get away with it, you can really flush your career down the toilet. Small joint manipulation is a discrete form of cheating that is very difficult to detect and is rarely, if ever, penalized in the UFC. Small joint manipulation consists of stuff like cranking your opponent's fingers and toes to cause pain or injury, and I honestly can't think of a single instance where this was called out by a referee. However, on the other hand, I can't think of a single instance where this happened in a fight, which is why it is here on this list. But if I were a fighter, I would definitely do this to get an advantage, since fingers and toes constantly get broken in fights, and as a result, it would be rather difficult to pin the blame for an injured joint on an instance of small joint manipulation. So yes, if you cheat in your fights, I would definitely recommend doing more of this where you can, as it can be extremely effective in basically every grappling exchange to ever exist. Now, we are really getting to the top tier of cheating in MMA, and from here on out, you might start seeing more and more familiar fouls. Strikes to the back of the head are banned in every combat sport due to how they can damage the brainstem, which can result in permanent and irreversible damage that can cripple people for life. However, that doesn't mean that fighters don't do it. In fact, they do it all the time and even score TKOs with it. For example, in the 5th round of Charles Oliveira's rematch with Michael Chandler, Chandler nearly TKO'd Charles with shots to the back of the head, with referee Keith Peterson not saying a single thing as he watched. And then there's virtually every finish that Cyril Gane has gotten in the UFC, where he relentlessly and violently pummels the back of his opponent's head with punches and hammer fists until they wilt. Punching the back of the head deals a ton of damage because of how vulnerable that area is, and due to how hesitant referees are to step in and deduct points for this foul, shots to the back of the head end up becoming one of the most effective finishing techniques in this sport. And it is quite likely going to stay that way until someone ends up taking irreversible damage that makes referees start policing the foul more. Intentionally missing weight is one of the most underrated ways to cheat in MMA, as it is basically a pay-to-win strategy in the UFC. As everybody who follows MMA knows, cutting weight is one of the roughest parts of an already brutal sport, with many fighters considering weight cuts to be harder than the actual fight itself. Fighters drain themselves of nutrients, electrolytes, and water to make weight, all of which compromises them greatly. And intentionally missing weight can help to keep a fighter from compromising himself as much as his opponent. Missing weight can help improve every aspect of a fighter's performance, from strength to cardio to power. It can even help with their chin, as they will have more cerebral fluid in their head to protect their brain from concussions. Now, of course, fighters can't miss weight for title fights, but for basically every other bout, they can miss weight and still get the win. One of the most egregious examples of this was Kelvin Gastelum versus Daniel Rodriguez, a fight that was originally booked at 170 pounds, but got bumped up to 185 at the last minute because Kelvin couldn't resist the allure of the Mexican taco truck. And well, Kelvin gave up a percentage of his fight purse and proceeded to use his weight advantage to wrestle D-Rod to a decision W. Kelvin Gastelum also did this against Dustin Stoltzfus, where he missed weight by 5 pounds in middleweight and got the win. And remember what I said about the increased amount of brain fluid that helps to protect your brain from concussions? Well, Kelvin Gastelum is considered to have one of the best chins in the history of the sport. And that is what makes missing weight pay to win. In the UFC, the only penalty for missing weight is a fine, but it is still worth it if you are able to leverage the weight miss to get the win because you will get your win bonus. And while there is the possibility that your opponent won't take the fight if the weight miss is too egregious, in many cases, fighters are too financially insecure to not take the fight, and they also face pressure from the UFC to take the fight regardless of the weight miss. However, I will add that in other promotions that have stricter rule sets for weight misses, this strategy won't work. Notably, in KSW, there is a rule that was recently introduced that leads to an automatic point deduction for weight misses. And in that certain promotion that allows soccer kicks and stomps that I was talking about at the beginning of this video, those who miss weight not only face a point deduction and a fine, but will have the fight overturned to a no contest if they happen to win. Which may sound harsh, but it is no doubt an effective method to prevent this form of intentional cheating. Fence grabs are the undisputed king of takedown defense in MMA, and if you want to be a top fighter, you should definitely be grabbing the fence as much as you can. Fence grabs are absolutely a 100% intentional foul every time, but referees are extremely hesitant to take points for them, and there's a reason for that. Now, while this foul is useful for any fighter who's trying to defend takedowns, it is particularly advantageous for a certain kind of fighter, and that is flashy strikers who the UFC are desperately trying to promote and have win. Just to give you a few examples, there's O'Malley grabbing the fence in his fight with Petr Yan, Sharon Magomedov grabbing the fence in his fight with Antonio Trocoli, and, most notoriously, Conor grabbing the fence in his fight with Khabib. Notice how, in all these instances, there was no point taken, and in O'Malley and Conor's cases, there wasn't even a warning. And that is because if the UFC wants a flashy striker who they're pushing to win, you bet they'll be giving him every chance he can get to keep the fight standing. So, if you fit into this archetype, just do it. Grab the fence and grab the win along with it. You'll get away with it 100%. Now we're getting into the top 3 fouls you should be using, and I have to place the groin strike here. The groin strike is a fantastic multi-purpose foul that you should be throwing a minimum of 1 per fight, and let me explain why. Strikes to the groin can almost always be ruled unintentional, making it very unlikely for the referee to take a point. Sure, if you kick your opponent in the dick too many times like Bruno Silva did against Manel Kape, the ref might step in to take a point, but it is nonetheless very rare. And if you're fighting on friendly soil, like Usman or Magomedov did against Paul Hughes, you can do it as many times as you want. The way to think about groin strikes, and specifically kicks to the groin, is that they're kind of like a kick to the liver that is much more likely to hurt your opponent. You would know this if you've ever been kicked down there, but the pain radiates in a way that can actually wind you in a similar way to a body kick, and you can use it strategically in the following ways. First, there is kicking your opponent in the cup to buy time to catch your breath, which can be a lifesaver in a fight when you're gassing out. Therefore, if you're fighting an opponent like Merab or Anthony Hernandez who's trying to weaponize their cardio against you, you can thwack them in the ding dong of it to pause the relentless onslaught. This also applies to countering flow state strikers like Max Holloway and Manel Kape, who are very dangerous when they get a read on their opponent's rhythm and start to throw volume. And I mean, there's a reason why Bruno Silva survived until the 3rd round against Kape while Brandon Royval got slept in the 1st. And that is because Silva was constantly breaking Kape's flow state by kicking him in the balls. Another way to use the groin strike is to set up your own strikes, most notably the open stance body and head kick. As most of you would know, the most common way that groin strikes happen is the inside low kick to the thigh. By kicking your opponent in the groin, you can get them to lower their guard, which just happens naturally because of the extreme pain in the loins. In most striking systems, fighters are told to think about 3 targets: the leg, the body, and the head. But by kicking your opponent in the balls, they will start to subconsciously worry about the hidden 4th target, the peener. And it's not like you can get rid of this instinct as a man. The family jewels are your reproductive organs, and as an organism that reproduces sexually, you have an instinct to protect them, because if they go splat, your chances of leaving offspring goes bye-bye. So just punt your opponent in the junk, then go to the body and the head with the kick to set up a highlight reel KO. It's that simple. The final use for groin strikes is to get a fight you're losing to get ruled a no contest. Now, of course, you would have to do this before the halfway point of a fight, because then the fight will just go to a technical decision and you'll end up losing regardless. But if you get in the cage and just immediately find yourself outmatched, kick your opponent in the balls as hard as possible and cross your fingers that they can't continue. And those are the reasons why groin kicks are a must for every dirty fighter's arsenal. The runner-up for the best fouls in MMA are, of course, the eye poke. Eye pokes are a very versatile foul and are a favorite of the UFC's official GOAT of the sport.
So Daniel Cormier is saying before the fight that I'll end up poking him in the eyes at some point. And the reason why he says that is because I do poke people in the eyes. And it's very illegal, but I do it.
As you just heard there, you can intentionally poke your opponent in the eye and still be the GOAT of the sport according to Dana White and the UFC. So you should definitely taking a pointer there, okay? Pun intended. Eye pokes are an incredibly useful foul because, just like groin kicks, there are a plethora of ways to use them. Like groin kicks, you can use them to catch your breath. And to back up my point here, here's the 30-plus UFC fight veteran, Derek Lewis, saying that he does this intentionally.
And I cheat, shit. Any means necessary. If I want to start poking the eyes and all that, I'm going to poke you in the eye. Because you're going to get a warning. They're not going to take a point soon you poke somebody in the eye. Shit, everybody know that. Yeah, so I'm going to knee them in the nuts, poke them in the eye, and do whatever illegal. Then they say, oh, no, I'm going to be like, oh, man, my bad, I didn't mean to do that. But just know, it's going to be on record, right? Just know that if I ever do that in my previous fight, just know I'm laughing on the inside and saying that I got your ass.
Second, you can damage your opponent's eye, which of course is a huge advantage, especially in striking where eyesight is crucial to see strikes coming. Notably, Justin Gaethje eye-poked Edson Barboza badly, and then KO'd Edson with a strike thrown to the side where he had been poked. You can use the threat of an eye poke to zone your opponent, as John Jones famously did with his long guard, which was a crucial factor in his dominance because it helped to cover up his lackluster boxing ability. And of course, you can use an eye poke to end a fight early and get a no contest. And also, there's the big advantage that most eye pokes are ruled unintentional, which is demonstrated by how MMA's most notorious eye poker, John Jones, has never had a point deducted for eye pokes throughout his entire career. And as you just heard from him, John Jones does this intentionally. Now, I believe that eye pokes are neck and neck with groin strikes for second place, but there is a reason why I give eye pokes the slight edge. And that is that every man knows what it's like to get hit down there, right? Even if you've never been kicked in the junk, every man has had at least one hard blow to the donger in their life that made them hate existence itself before. But eye pokes are something that fans really don't understand, which is why when Tom Aspinall got brutally poked, they all called him a quitter. You don't understand how bad eye pokes are until you personally have been poked. In my case, I've gotten very lightly poked in sparring before once, and it was just a horrific experience. It's not just the finger that causes damage, but the sweat and grime on the finger that causes further irritation. However, since most fans of the UFC don't actually train in the sport of MMA, they never know how bad it is. And as a result, if you get your opponent to quit to an eye poke, you can make them look like a bitch. Again, just look at what happened to Tom Aspinall. Grabbing your opponent's gloves is similar to grabbing their shorts, but I would say that this method of cheating is more effective in just about every way, which is why glove grabs take home the gold medal for cheating in MMA. Glove grabs are basically a form of wrist control that your opponent is going to have a very difficult time working himself out of, and can be used for a variety of offensive and defensive techniques. When it comes to offense, Islam Makhachev notoriously uses glove grabs to set up many of his judo throws, which are a major part of his grappling offense. And despite doing this in almost every single one of his title fights, he has never even been warned for this foul. Tim Elliott used glove grabs to control Tagir Ulanbekov's positioning during their fight, and even openly admitted to doing so after winning the fight without getting a point deduction. When it comes to defensive uses, there's the time that Charles Oliveira grabbed Dustin Poirier's glove to establish control of Poirier's arm, setting up an omoplata that lets Oliveira sweep Dustin. Another example of a defensive glove grab can be seen in Nathaniel Wood's fight against Muhammad Naimov, where in the third round, after Wood dropped Naimov badly, Naimov hooked Nathaniel's glove to prevent follow-up ground and pound, and this led to Naimov winning the fight by unanimous decision. And that's not the end of it when it comes to ways to use the glove grab. Glove grabs are useful in orthodox versus southpaw hand fighting. You can use them to prevent your opponent from striking or defending effectively in the clinch. You can use them to set up your own submissions. And I mean, there's just countless examples of fighters grabbing gloves. There's Rainier de Ritter grabbing Robert Whittaker's gloves, Tim Kennedy grabbing Yoel Romero's gloves, and just countless others. However, the number one reason why glove grabs rank so highly on this list is this. As far as I am aware, there's no instance where a UFC fighter has had a point taken away for a glove grab in UFC history. The closest there's ever been is Leon Edwards in his trilogy fight with Kamaru Usman, where he was warned for grabbing Usman's gloves. And Leon did get a point deducted in that fight. But that point deduction was for grabbing the fence, not the gloves. Glove grabs are difficult for the referee to spot due to how they can look like plain old wrist control from a distance. There is basically no reason not to grab your opponent's gloves in a fight. If you are a fighter and you want to win, you should be grabbing your opponent's gloves. Charles Oliveira does it. Islam Makhachev does it. And those two guys are two of the most popular fighters on the planet. There is no penalty in the cage, and there's no harm done to your reputation outside of it. It is hands down the best way to cheat, and you should do it if you want to win. So, that is my conclusive ranking for all of the fouls in MMA and which ones are the most effective. I don't have much else to say besides, well, it would be better if nobody cheated. But in a sport where cheating is waved away as much as MMA, you might want to consider cheating to make it to the top. Now, it's the fight business, and you might as well take every advantage you can get. And who knows, maybe you can become the GOAT of the sport too by cheating your way to the top. Goodbye.